Muy buenas tardes para todos.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to resume our sessions now. This is the second part of our second day on the 8th Regional Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction for the Americas and the Caribbean. We would like to also welcome those of you joining us through the online platform, through the Hoping platform. And we'd also like to remind you that you will be able to access the Red de Contacto feature, the contact network feature, which will enable you to get in touch with everyone else. In order to access this network, you can click on the icon, the network icon on the right side of your screen. You can click on Join. And in order to leave the session, you have to click the button Leave. We'd also like to remind you that there are 50 members of the LAC network of women fighting towards the reduction of this disaster risk reduction. And they are fighting and working towards integrating the gender perspective in this session. We're going to start now with the plenary session number 3, titled Evidence-Based Financing of Resilient Development, a Strategic Approach to Sustainable and Efficient Investments. This will be has been organized by the Central American Institute of Public Administration, ICAP, as well as the Global Network of Civil Society Organization for Disaster Reduction, GNDR, and the Development Bank of Latin America, CAF. Lizra Fabian will be the moderator. She's a coordinator for Dominica and member of the board of directors of Global Arise. She's the main representative of the private sector through the organization called DIKE. It fosters positive networks between private companies. She has always been advocating for risk reduction through the Chambers of Commerce in the Caribbean, and she's currently a member of the board of directors of Global Arise Network.
Kudos. I'm really pleased to moderate the session, this important plenary session, and we do thank you for investing your time with us. You could have been somewhere else, but you chose to be here, and we are really grateful for that. In order to move towards sustainable and resilient development in our countries, and knowing that we need to adapt and prepare to assume the challenges of high uncertainty in economic, social, environmental, and governance matters, this panel will address disaster risk reduction and the instruments and mechanisms for planning, public planning and budgeting, as well as private and public sector partnerships and initiatives. We're really delighted that we have an amazing panel of experts who will share with us good practices, lessons learned, and their experiences from different sectors in financing disaster risk reduction. And we'll look at it from evidence-based sustainable development. So as a representative of the private sector, I believe that it is really important to ensure that the private sector is involved and we have meaningful partnerships. It was mentioned yesterday that we need to form partnerships before disasters or before the risk happens. And this partnership, of course, would be important for urgency and working together to reduce disaster risk. We are also discussing financing. We are seeking to implement solutions, innovative solutions for disaster risk reduction. So today, I would like to introduce our panelists. We have Gerardo Amarella de Nicola, the Undersecretary of the Environment for Uruguay. Welcome. We have Francois Boerit, the representative in Uruguay of the Development Bank of Latin America, CAF. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we also have Alfredo Ibrahim Flores Sarria, Executive Secretary for COSIFIN. Welcome. And of course, we have Carolina Diaz Girallo, the Director for Environment and Sustainable Development of the National Planning Department of Colombia. Welcome, Carolina. We're going to begin our panel by moving into our first round of questions. And there, our panelists will share their perspectives on one or more of these questions. So considering the importance of incorporating disaster risk reduction in planning and budgeting process for financing of sustainable and resilient development, here are the 3 questions. First of all, why is it important to incorporate green taxonomies to advance the financing of sustainable and resilient development in the planning process? Secondly, what is the relevance of tagging climate and disaster risk management spending in the accounting of a nation's budget? And thirdly, how is it possible to incorporate the quantification of natural capital to value ecosystem assets and use them to as adaptation measures based on solutions in nature? So we have 3 questions, and we invite you to choose which one. If you want to answer one or if you want to answer more, we welcome you to do so. So our first speaker, Gerardo, we invite you to give your presentation.
Bien, muchas gracias. Un placer estar aquí.
Thank you so much for having me today.
En realidad, respondiendo a la primera pregunta,
I would like to answer the first question.
resulta fundamental
I believe that is key and crucial
esta concepción
to include this notion
de taxonomías verdes
of green taxonomies
inversiones,
when it comes to investments. And we really need to consider, to understand that the need of these investments made in a country or in a certain society, they have to target a sustainable development growth.
estamos hoy en Uruguay viendo
Sustainable growth. So in Uruguay, we have a special situation when it comes to droughts,
las consecuencias que estamos viviendo
and we are suffering lots of consequences, loss of biodiversity, loss of productivity, even social impacts that we have discussed earlier with the International Organization of Migration, social losses that we are experiencing in this country.
haber previsto oportunamente inversiones.
Perhaps this is due because we haven't predicted the needed investments with this sustainable growth notion in our minds, working towards the disaster risk reduction. And this is due to climate change as well. So I believe that it's key to have this notion in mind, this perspective, which also helps as a bridge of dialogue between the civil society, the government at different levels as well, private companies, academia, who are constantly exchanging this dialogue and sharing what the need of this new perception is so important in the design of budgeting and the future of a nation. So I believe that there is where the best road lies ahead, in that dialogue between civil society and the rest of the sectors of society in order to predict these negative environmental effects and the need for these investments. I would also like to say and add and add certain things to what my colleague, the Minister Gerardo, has said. To begin with, incorporating this notion of green taxonomies provides a common language, a common standard for us. And this common standard is important because this helps us work towards sustainability. And this allows us to channel the capital in an efficient way. And this gives us a long-term vision of economic strength in order to work towards mitigation and adaptation to climate change in the long term. In addition, we should be able to differentiate between the activities that can improve this process. So, for example, these transitional activities and greening activities, so ecological activities that help us improve this facilitating process. In my opinion, I would also like to add to what my colleagues have said. To begin with, I'd like to thank you for having me today on behalf of CAF, of all my colleagues. And being part of this event is very important to me, and this is a key event in this topic that we are addressing today. I would like to touch upon the first question. Why do we keep insisting on these green taxonomies? As my colleagues have mentioned, I believe that the main challenge that we have ahead is related to a debt that we have. For a long time, we've had it. We're being very reactive, but I think it's good that we are reacting. So we need to face this challenge quickly. And in order to act quickly, I believe that we need to mobilize a number of resources, that is a very substantial number of resources, in order to attain these goals and to address this emergency, this climate change emergency. In order to achieve this, first of all, we need to understand each other. And this means having this common language, as my colleague has mentioned. This common language means having a system in place or a mechanism, which is these green taxonomies, that will enable us to reach these standards and also create mechanisms that allows us to measure the impact of these events. These are also transparency mechanisms that are key in the implementation of these funds, and also accountability mechanisms. In a nutshell, this is what I wanted to answer to this question. Why is it so important to integrate green taxonomies in our systems?
Great. Thank you so much for sharing these insights. We also have Carolina, who will share with us from virtually.
Hola, buenas tardes. Yo aprovecho para darle un
Hello,
saludo
good afternoon. I would like to greet everyone on this panel, all my panelists, colleagues, and I would also like to thank everyone present remotely. I think it's a great opportunity to analyze why these biodiversity involved in the risk reduction systems that we're analyzing are key in creating sustainable goals, both in the Americas as well as in the Caribbean. I would also like to mention on 3 topics. First of all, we need to bridge the financing gap in order to achieve this resilient economy, the decarbonization of our society as well. Secondly, we need to promote private and public investments of the international community. It has to be an effective investment. It has to be impactful. And I think that's why, as countries, we have to establish the right circumstances so our economies can be competitive, fair, and reasonable. And I think that's why these green taxonomies are such key instruments. Colombia was the first country in Latin America to publish a green taxonomy, which was a year ago. We find in this a key element, a key tool in planning processes, because it allows us to create common languages, transparent languages in these green investments. That's why we implemented these projects. We are able to identify what information the investors need in order to assess what are the environmental benefits in a certain asset, how we can work towards these environmental targets. So this also creates better opportunities for our investors. It makes it more attractive to them. We're also able to access green financial markets in the world, and that's why we can really profit from these private and public assets. And also, we're trying to avoid greenwashing thanks to this. We all know that these taxonomies have several common aspects in the way they are designed, but of course, these have to be adapted to the specifics of each country and each region. Therefore, there's a key aspect here. In Colombia, the main environmental and climate change issue is deforestation. So loss of biodiversity, ecosystems. Unfortunately, this is the main source of greenhouse effect carbon emissions, which is why our green taxonomy has 2 pillars. The first one works towards mitigating climate change, and the other pillar works towards soil, agriculture, livestock production, and that's why we are trying to disincentivize the deforestation. We also face certain challenges. So how this taxonomy is applied in Colombia? Well, it's voluntary, so that's a challenge for us. And then we also have an important challenge ahead, which is how to make these investors, these key parties, understand that taxonomy has to be a requirement. The data availability is also quite a challenge for us, in particular when it comes to considering the adaptation and implementation of the disaster risk reduction systems. And this leads me to my last point, how to bridge this gap, this financing gaps. How can we target the right investments, in particular when we have certain fiscal challenges? In Colombia, we have a public investment system that is integrated. We're able to identify these needs. We have a classification of the expenses for each project. Some of them are adaptation, some are mitigation. And we're not just talking about risk reduction, we also talk about risk mitigation, risk management, disaster management, governance. So this classification helps us standardize certain concepts. We're also able to follow up where the investments go, and we are able to assess where we are underestimating or overestimating these tax benefits, for example, or help. That allows us to have a long and middle term view on where to tackle certain issues or perhaps improve or raise certain investments. Finally, I'd like to talk about natural capital quantification. We can have a quantitative assessment of these elements of nature solution-based adaptation measures in order to implement certain works to reduce the risk of disasters. But we have 3 bottlenecks. This is very intensive when it comes to data, time, and resources. The models that are being used have a lot of conceptual or a lot of abstract notions, which unfortunately don't adapt to all the different territories, so it's difficult to replicate across the board. And lastly, this monetary valuation in an ecosystem project is quite controversial still. No one questions how important natural capital is, but we believe that this should be quantified properly. So this is still a work in progress for Colombia. We have several approaches, several methodologies, several challenges, but this definitely requires high levels of engagement and participations in order to bridge that divide and to tackle these issues. And lastly, in Colombia, we have all these tools and elements that help to lower risk reduction, but we need to mobilize climate change, fighting against climate change, but we also need to decentivize all the activities that go against our work towards adaptation and risk reduction management. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this intervention, Carolina. And I saw that over the different interventions, we looked at ensuring that we have the dialogue between civil society and other stakeholders, which is extremely important. We looked at understanding and being able to measure, ensuring that we are measuring transparently and we have accountability. We also look at bridging the gap between financing and promoting effective and impactful investments as well. We do have a contribution from Diana Cardenas, and this will be a virtual contribution, so we invite you to look at this contribution.
Muy buen día con todos y todas. Es un gran gusto estar aquí
Good
con
morning. It's a pleasure to be with you and open this discussion with regard the challenges and opportunities given the climate change financing perspective. First of all, I would like to highlight that this topic has a very important element. We need to have data, evidence to see what we are facing, how much we are spending, and how much we will have to spend in the future for climate change and avoid all the damages that we are currently suffering and avoid the impact on the economy and millions of lives and ecosystems that are vital for our survival. Based on this information, we will be able to identify financing gaps and generate solutions to finance resilience and climate solutions. Let me give you some information about the financing needs and the costs that we are currently facing. Climate-related changes account for 1.7% of the GDP according to World Bank data, but these costs will continue growing. And by 2030, the cost due to loss and damage in developing countries may account for $500 million. So the question is, where are we going to get the resource to address these climate change costs? The reality is that developing countries cannot absorb these costs, and there are many challenges to access climate change and adaptation financing. International financing flows that reach developing countries for climate change adaptation are 5 to 10 times lowest to the estimated needs. In addition to these, the commitment of developed countries due to their historical responsibility of moving $100 billion by 2020 into developing countries has not been met. Given the indebtedness context that prevent countries from having the fiscal ability to face the climate change crisis. In Latin America, the debt has increased to $5.8 billion, and globally, many other countries face the same situation. So the debt crisis is upcoming. This is the current context, and although it's not very optimistic, I would like to change gears and underscore some of the elements that came out of COP27, which are very hopeful. Some progress in certain discussions, like, for example, loss and damage financing, which was a difficult topic in all climate negotiations. In COP27, the Fund for Loss and Damage was created. Today is an empty wallet, but is a major step forward to continue promoting the financing towards the countries that really need it. The reform of inclusion and the financial system in the text of the report of COP27, calling for transformation of multilateral financial institutions and the global financial structure to meet global targets. This was a minor change. And there is another initiative, the Bridge Count, promoted by the government of Barbados. This initiative proposes solutions to cater the debt crisis and the climate crisis, having an emergency liquidity fund to avoid debt, using different special withdrawal systems and other objectives to respond immediately to disasters, as it was done with the pandemic. It also provides non-reimbursable funds for loss and damage, for resilience and climate adaptation. Let me underscore that last year, two mechanisms were created in Bretton Woods with the Trust Fund for Resilience and Sustainability, and with the launch by the World Bank of the Global Climate Risk Shield, which is a great opportunity for developing countries to access finance or funds by developing countries. There are many other topics regarding climate financing, but a key topic is the new climate financing goal. This discussion is ongoing and should be finished or completed by 2025. And this target will replace the $100 billion. And without further ado, I call on you to have a very fruitful session with many proposals and to make the best of these regional convergence in order to reach convergence and reach international fora, so that the necessary funds reach to address the climate crisis and resilience, and to address all climate related loss and damage. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very fruitful session.
Very insightful in sharing both the challenges as well as some of the opportunities and best practices across the region. Now we are going to go to our panelists again to find out some of the best practices, the experiences, and the lessons that you have learned in financing for evidence-based sustainable development. So first, we'll start with Gerardo. We invite you to share your experiences.
Bueno, en realidad,
Actually,
yo recuerdo que en los años 80,
I recall that in the 80s, well, almost last century, in some documents of the then European Economic Commission, we said that political proposals should prevail over environmental proposals 40 years ago. And I thought that we would never reach to that point in Latin America. And ministers of economy were not familiar with environmental related issues, were not included in their agendas. Thanks God, things have changed. In Uruguay, for example, the current economy minister is a green minister. Since the beginning of her mandate, she started discussing the environmental issues both internationally and at home. Well, when we talk about best practices, well, in the design of one of the financing bonds that is tied to climate change indicators, there was some preliminary work, including environment executives, finance, foreign affairs, and we were able to exchange and work together in this topic, including resilience related topics, environmental and sustainable development, and were translated into a public policy that is goes beyond the scope of the Ministry of the Environment. I think that that was a good experience. Ministers from different ministries start discussing this internally and as part of the development of public policy. Another example regarding financing, which is very brand new, that has started to be included, particularly at a local government level, let's say departments or provinces, that include in their budgets climate change topics and try to allocate specific resources in their budgets for the necessary investments resulting from climate change impacts. These are some of the examples that we have in our country, and I think that it's a good opportunity to share with the rest.
Different budgets, and I think that's a great example for other countries. We'll move to Alfredo. So Alfredo could share with us his examples on good practices and lessons learned.
Sí, me gustaría traer a colación
I would like to share with you the example from Mexico in Mesoamerica. I would like to share with you an analysis 1990-2019 that shows the relevance of including macro-fiscal regulations that have allowed for fiscal sustainability in the financing of public investment projects. And the purpose is to create or to generate economic growth and to have the GDP debt going downwards in the mid and long term. And this means that the government's debt should be sustainable in terms of its investment when it is capable to have primary surplus to finance it. In Mexico, the federal law on budget affects the non-financial public sector. And this sector must maintain a budget equilibrium, but does not contemplate spending caps, and therefore there is no limit for indebtedness. However, it provides that when primary surplus is generated, surplus should be channeled towards stabilization funds that can be used to reduce the debt vis-a-vis the budget and not necessarily to cover the debt. So in Mexico's experience, in my opinion, is a lesson learned for sustainable development financing that goes beyond financing mechanisms themselves and that address the regulatory framework that address these with regard to your financing.
The surplus funding being channeled to sustainable funds. I think even within the private sector and with different organizations, ensuring that we have funds that we invest in resilience is extremely important. So thank you for sharing this example from Mexico. Next, we move to Francois to share with us your best practices, lessons learned, any experiences in financing.
Sure, thanks. Desde CAF, algunos pensamientos.
From CAF, some insights. I would say I invite you to think very briefly about this journey. The minister has said that we've been doing this for a while already, but sometimes we are in a rush. And thanks God, we have instruments and a common language and common goals and objectives. And that is significant progress because it moves us to specific targets. And I think that we have to design them all together. We have to meet them in partnership. And so this task, CAF and other multilateral agencies, including different agendas, is a need for a multi-party dialogue. And SDS are indicators that lead us to accomplish common objectives. For example, I live here in Uruguay, and I am very proud to say, although I'm a foreigner, the success in Uruguay at the level of the Ministry of Economy. It's an example that is worthwhile replicating. And multilateral organizations should support these type of programs and copy them in other countries. With regard to lessons learned, well, this is an ongoing progress. We have learned a lot, but we still have a long way to go. So we need to be mutually supportive and continue learning. And best practices, and going to what I mentioned at the beginning, we have to work all together. CAF, in terms of good practices, partnered, for example, first it was accredited as an agency when GCDF, and then the Adaptation Fund. And as such, it became a strategic partner for mobilizing resources in the region. And at the same time, this helps reducing the gaps and accessing funds. In December 2022, we mobilized $500 million through co-financing strategies. And CAF provided $350 million. CAF also, in partnership with other stakeholders, financial institutions like the European Union and European and Asian banks, is designing partnerships to obtain more resources and reach that alignment that we mentioned at the very beginning.
Hear what CAF is doing. I think this is the first time I'm hearing of the work that you've done in mobilizing finance within the region. And it's also good that as you're here in Uruguay, you see the good practices of the government and you're able to share it with everyone today. We invite Carolina to share her best practices, her lessons learned with us at this time.
Me encanta esa pregunta sobre financiamiento para el desarrollo sostenible basado en la
I love
evidencia.
this question about evidence-based financing. Here in my country is similar to the other countries. Over the past 20 years, 88% of the events are hydrometeorological and climate. We do have institutional and regional risk management. 75% of the funds are for emergency management, reconstruction, and the remaining percentage are for mitigation works and it account for 2%. When we talk about knowledge, planning requires information that is needed for the allocation of resources, because we are associating them to the resources, but not to the design of public policies. That will help us to approach from a planning and preventive point of view, and that will help us to move the funds in a more effective manner. In 2019, we built a tool called the Municipal Risk Index based on capabilities or adjusted by capabilities, contemplating the different features, including vulnerability, given the different characteristics of the municipalities based on their limitations and capabilities to manage the risk conditions. The risk is related to rainfall, excesses, floods, landslide, rainfall deficit, drought, fires, and it allowed us to design public policies in a differentiated manner using a preventive approach. The country is highly heterogeneous and we cannot apply a standard strategy to make decisions. It helps us to allocate technical assistance and budgetary assistance, and it's helping us for follow-up, how municipalities are improving in their progress, and it helps us to address better the policies. So currently, we are using the index to manage the risk. We provide technical assistance for the municipalities that are risk-prone, help them in designing projects, and we use them as criteria to allocate budget for different works. So this tool, and this is what we would like to share with you, is quite straightforward, it's easy to understand and interpret, it's based on historical information, census and open data that is provided by our technical and scientific institutions and can be replicated in other countries, as we did with Chile and Peru and in some other Brazilian states. This is the lesson that we wanted to share with you.
Thank you very much for sharing this, Carolina. Quite insightful. I think many persons in our audience would want to find out from our panelists about innovation and innovative financing mechanisms for sustainable and resilient development with an emphasis on disaster risk reduction and climate action. So can you share with us what your opinion is on this? This time we'll start with Alfredo, and then we could move to Francois, and then we come to Gerardo, and of course, Carolina.
Ok, muchas gracias.
All right, thank you so much for your question. To begin with, I think that we need to reach a financing mechanism to achieve sustainable development, highlighting the reduction of disaster risk potential. So the climate action is a very highly complex task. So perhaps we don't need to talk about financing mechanisms as such, like sustainable bonds. Instead, we should discuss, or we talk about the creation or the strengthening of the market infrastructure for sustainable development. So our Treasury Department or Finance Department play a vital role in the coordination of this development. To begin with, of the taxonomies that we need for the classification of green projects, of sustainable projects. That is, to create this common language that we were referring to earlier. In addition, the creation of information on green investments and sustainable investments. And finally, it's important to define which are the applicable standards for each one of the countries, such as ESGs, the products and financial instruments, and the regulatory framework that is needed to enforce the engagement of financial sectors, investors, service providers like certifying services, as well as other institutions within the public sector. as well as financial supervisors or central banks, together with other key players of the private sectors that need to be involved. It's clear that this synergy is important between these sectors. Moreover, when we talk about financing mechanisms, beyond this innovation feature or how relevant there is, we believe that it's important to highlight why these mechanisms towards sustainable development are unique. These sustainable bonds are different to traditional financial products in which you require a very strict supervision or surveillance, like the one Carolina was talking about, in order to ensure that the funds that have been harvested through these bonds are in fact allocated towards the purposes that were initially intended. So these follow-up or surveillance mechanism is key. And I believe this is where we need to focus on, and where all these resources and efforts need to be allocated towards.
Thank you very much.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Bien, del lado de CAF es para nosotros importante
In CAF, we believe that
lo que hablábamos hace un instante, ¿no? Este es un aprendizaje continuo.
this is a continuous process of learning. We're continuously learning on this topic.
A través de ese comentario es
What do I mean by that?
nuestra paleta de productos o nuestro mix de productos y
Our product portfolio or products or service portfolio is constantly being updated and improved because we're constantly trying to find the better services and how to speed up the risk reduction. This is why we're constantly reviewing our products and services in order to enhance our offer of financial services. We have asked our investing countries as well as the companies that are involved, who are involved in this sovereign and non-sovereign risk. We have a multi-annual technical cooperation product encouraging green agendas in order to encourage green transactions as well as biodiversity, climate, in order to strengthen the design of green operations of our clients. And in its role of Green Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean, CAF commits to find the necessary mechanisms to capture the resources that are needed and provide the answers that are expected. So, for example, encouraging green bonds in capital markets, loans with financial allies and partners. And we're also focusing on co-financing transaction. We also promote multilateral financing funds, both reimbursable and non-reimbursable. Sorry, go on.
Have your intervention and then Carolina.
Bueno, en realidad, yo iba a hacer referencia nuevamente como una
I was going to mention a success story that I have to share. Of a sovereign bond related to climate change indicators. You may know that this has been a key experience for a country based on the climate change commitments in line with the Paris Agreement. And the interest rate was defined there, which is linked to both greenhouse gas emissions as well as the maintenance of natural resources in order to tackle issues like droughts and floodings. There are several aspects I would like to highlight. To begin with, the previous work that has been conducted, and this also, and we also want to highlight the support that we receive from CAF, the United Nations, as well as other entities and bodies that supported us, the officials in the Ministry of Economy, Finances, Environment Department. This coordinated support and work helped us align with each other towards these goals. We speak the same language, as I said earlier. We have this common language. We are using the same tools to achieve these common goals. So this coordinated and common work was key in order to launch this sovereign bond. Of course, this bond is tied to certain climate change indicators. And it is important to highlight that once this bond was issued into the market, it had a huge success only a few hours after being launched or issued into the market. I think we had more than 180 investors that purchased these bonds immediately. And of course, as our colleagues highlighted earlier, this post-commitment, we have penalties, we have fines. If we don't meet these climate change goals, we have to pay more interest rates. And of course, there are rewards if we do comply with these. This is quite clear. You have to conduct a very strict follow-up. These investors will also be closely checking whether our reports have been manufactured or are transparent and real. And that's why we provide a roadmap for them. And I believe that this should be the roadmap that we need to follow in terms of our behavior. I think this is the most relevant experience I could share with you from our country. Thank you.
Carolina, thank you.
Sí, coincidimos que el sector financiero tiene un
I
papel
agree that the financial sector plays a key role when it comes to covering these financial needs for transition. And Colombia is similar to Uruguay in terms of issuing green bonds in the market in the national currency through a bidding process. And we think these are key elements in order to strengthen and to leverage these investments, because these are resources that the government have in order to improve their projects. Of course, we need the mapping, approval, and considering all the elements necessary to launch these potential investments. These resources are allocated to certain projects within the portfolio. The building of this portfolio was led by the Treasury Department because the Environment and Planning Ministry was also involved. We also wanted to foster the transparency, and we needed to name an external party in order to oversee this system. This is done through BGO Iris, who is part of ISG Solutions. We think that these green bonds, when they were issued, were very well received in the market. The first bid included $150 million in green bonds with a 10-year deadline, with a 10-year expiry date, And this accounted for 4.5 times higher than we had expected initially. Later on, we included $133 million, and the value that was issued was almost $300 million. So what I'm trying to say is that these resources are being allocated specifically to sustainable transportation, health systems, biodiversity protection, renewable energy, agricultural projects, how to waste management, for example. And this is very closely related to something that I had mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, which is green taxonomy. In Colombia, we're designing this not just for the private sector, but the purpose was to design this for the public sector as well, because the Colombian government intends for this green taxonomy to be implemented as soon as these bonds were issued, so we could have a new methodology to assess our budget. Up to this day, these bonds are very strong, and these are very good resources to encourage our sustainable projects. They help diversify the capital market, and this is definitely a good answer for the resiliency that we want to achieve. But of course, we have to take into account that these portfolios are quite traditional, especially when it comes to emission reduction. Unfortunately, currently, we don't have specific projects in terms of disaster reduction or adaptability to climate change because we don't have strong enough methodology to measure this climate change or this reduction, especially because our projects are usually short-lasting. But of course, we have a lot to improve on that front. That's what I'm trying to convey.
Great. Well, for me, I think it's quite insightful to hear of the different bonds that are available in the various countries, so Colombia, Uruguay, and I think this is a best practice. We could look at it, see how best to apply to our countries, and help to improve the financing of resilience in disaster risk reduction and climate change. At this time, we'll move to a more interactive discussion where our panelists will get to ask questions to the other panelists. So we invite Gerardo to ask your question to whichever panelist that you decide, and we invite all our panelists to be able to respond and interact and have this good dialogue so that all our audience will be able to understand.
Muy bien. Vamos a hacer una pregunta a nuestro colega de la CAF.
Okay, I would like to ask a question to my colleague from CAF. We work closely and we have a common goal, especially in Uruguay. I'd like to ask, how does CAF contribute to the private and public articulation in order to encourage the right circumstances to have resilient investments when it comes to climate change? I think this is key for most countries.
Sí, muchas gracias por la pregunta.
I really appreciate your question. To begin with, from a methodological point of view, at the beginning of a term, we speak to the incoming administration in which we review the national agenda. We review what the strategies of CAF are, these efficiency strategies as well, and which strength each country can provide in order to reach a consensus on every level. This is one of the areas in which we focus mostly. So encouraging, fostering these investments is important to us. And that is the situation when we start talking about promoting these investments, is when we start discussing all the potential mechanisms, tools, and we consider the potential funds, both that can be refunded or not, and these might be linked to results. So the potential products that we consider. These products are available for these countries in order to promote these investments. We try to analyze which is the country that has the best conditions in order to strengthen these negotiating these investments. I have an example to share with you, which is these bonds that we were talking about earlier. I believe that we need to follow the path that our minister is showing, which is to tie the compliance of the environmental targets to these finances that multilateral agencies are providing. I think there's quite an agreement in general in terms of how to follow these instructions. I think Uruguay is leading the way on this front. And I think this is a two-way street.
Thank you very much. You could also ask your question to another panelist. Yeah, so Francois?
Bueno, quería aprovechar para preguntarle
I'd like to ask Gerardo, who talked about this innovative debt instrument. In terms of the national policy on climate change that has been in place from 2017 in Uruguay, this policy considers the participation of multiple institutions of the Uruguayan government, as well as the private sector. To that end, I'd like to know which have been the most effective implementations or lines of action in order to improve the resilience of these public structure. That is roads, waters, waste management, in terms of extreme climate events like the drought that you mentioned earlier. And this will inevitably have an impact on food security, for example. And what are the lessons learned from this implementation of the national policy on climate change to date? And perhaps how could the rest of the countries in Latin America take this example? Well, thank you so much for asking this very insightful question. And to begin with, I'd like to say that what's more relevant about this climate change public policy is this first generation of climate change plans that came to being in Uruguay, and that led to many sectors to become involved, not just the government, but also academia, public and private sectors, also unions, food producers, or other sectors as well. I think this was the key element of this project. Thanks to this engagement, this policy became a national policy, which was able to stay in place beyond the administration. Once the government changed, unfortunately, we usually see this fading away. But in this case, this policy prevailed. When this happens, when these efforts are wasted, then there's a loss of a lot of work that has been conducted. Of course, when the administration changes, there are certain aspects that might be adapted, but this positive work and the positive results that have been achieved have been maintained in spite of the change of administration. In addition, there's been a positive, a successful adapting of the technologies of climate change that have been implemented in order to forecast or predict the climate change events. We also have a very interesting project that we're working with Argentina with the adaptation resources in terms of the Uruguay River Basin and the housing settlement around areas that could be flooded. How could the flora and fauna be recovered in areas that are being deeply affected, as well as dams? And there are a lot of projects taking place around this riverbank. I can mention many other successful projects, and of course, we're still working in the improvement of the water quality throughout the territory in order to have an alternative source of drinking water in the south of the country, where the highest population lives. When it comes to droughts, we keep working in order to improve this. The government has implemented several actions in order to help the rural population in our country, but we're also working with our team in the environment team and the environment department, as well as the financing and planning ministry, in order to find structural solutions to the droughts, because we know that this is something that we'll have to face in the long run, unfortunately. So we need to implement permanent and efficient measures in order to meet the needs of both people and animals. Thank you.
Very much for sharing this. Carolina?
Sí, yo quisiera hacerle una pregunta al
I would like
secretario.
to ask a question to Alfredo. From COSEFIN, different programs have been promoted for the different economic sectors for prevention. Can you share with us some key recommendations or bottlenecks that to improve financial protection and the positioning in the region?
Pregunta. muy interesante.
It's a very interesting question.
Bueno, la principal recomendación
The
es que
main
es
recommendation
efectivo
is that it is
poner
very important to promote two
fundamentales de acción. En
key
primer lugar,
action areas.
a los seguros
First of all,
contra eventos climáticos.
parametric insurance against climate change events. We all know that we need to take this type of insurance, and we promote the CRIF initiative. And second, something we are currently working on, the issuance of disaster bonds as transferent instruments to transfer the disaster risk. So when we talk about parametric insurance, that the current 7 members of COSEFIN is made up of the 5 Central American regions, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Guatemala, Salvador, Guatemala, Panama, Dominican Republic. So the 7 members, 3 are members of CRIF, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Panama. Panama recently joined this group, and this strategy helps mitigate losses due to extreme events and provides short-term liquidity to the different countries. By way of example, Nicaragua in 2020, CRIF provided 10.7 billion due to the Etna cyclone hurricane and $58 billion for Iota hurricane. And this was in a very particular context. There was a social and political crisis in 2018 as a consequence due to some economic contraction in 2019, the pandemic crisis, and a triple shock resulting from COVID-19 pandemic and these 2 tropical events that I have just mentioned. So the liquidity or the funds provided were allocated in a timely manner. In 2020, CRIF provided funds to Guatemala, accounting for $3.2 million for the Amanda tropical cyclone, and also to Panama, another amount for ETA hurricane. And in October 2022, Nicaragua received $8.92 million to address Julia disasters. And so these insurance were associated to extreme climate impact and disaster bonds. In December 2021, the Minister Council provided a resolution that that together with the World Bank, the secretariat of this institution should provide this appropriate mechanism and design this together with Treasury and Economy ministries, and provide actions for risk transfer instruments and take advantage of the lessons learned from other countries in this topic, particularly the countries that are members of the Pacific Alliance or the Pacific Partnership. We want to replicate these experiences. Bond is not debt, but a risk transfer instrument, and it has positive effects in the sovereign rating of the different countries, and it reduces also the cost if we work together in the modeling phase in partnership with multilateral institutions like CAF or the World Bank. These are my main recommendations to become or to acquire parametric insurance and to develop disaster bonds.
Thank you very much for your response on this. We ask Francois. Any question that you'd like to share? Okay. Okay, great. So I hope that everyone would have gotten some good insights from the questions shared among the panelists. Maybe I would just take a view at your hands if you've learned anything new or if something was insightful to you from this discussion so far. Could we see a show of hands? I'm seeing some hands definitely coming up in the audience. Great. So next, we have a contribution by GNDR from civil society on a question for our panelists.
Buenas tardes, muchas gracias por la oportunidad de
Good
poder
afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to invite me to this important plenary session. As GNDR, we are a global network of organizations of the civil society, and we have approximately 1,600 organizations that are community-based. So financing for them is non-existent, or it is subject to certain conditions. And at Latin America, we have approximately more than 350 civil society organizations, different size. And the question for you is the following. From the civil society, how can we design and implement financing mechanisms, including the civil society, in an intentional manner, and where these mechanisms actually seek to benefit societies and the most vulnerable populations?
That's a very good question. Who would like to go first? Okay, great.
Me atrevo a dar el primer paso.
I am going to volunteer.
CAF no es un banco.
CAF
Es un banco de desarrollo, sí, pero no es un
is a development bank, but it's not a commercial bank that has such level of capillarity that reaches all territories and reaches all communities and try to reach the country. And we do this through partnerships, like, for example, national development banks or other partners that help us reach closer, or that is like a broker and help us optimize our approach. For example, subnational municipalities, for example, as the Vice Minister mentioned, or the mayor's offices are the ideal channels. So through their offices, we can receive requests. For example, currently, we are starting a dialogue regarding droughts and try to find short, mid, and long-term solutions. So initially, the channels to reach and to receive requests and channel funds would be the municipalities, for example, and the municipalities would allocate and cascade the funds down to the communities. I think that it is a very in-keeping question. It's a challenge to include the civil society. When we design, for example, national climate adaptation and change policies, we try or we generate engagement instances, including the civil society. That is included in Uruguay's law. There are certain mechanisms that are contemplated by law, and there are other non-binding mechanisms whereby the civil society is invited, and we want to make them sustainable over time. Or in our administration, in addition to the organizations, as Fernando mentioned, we also include department governments, and through the department governments that they have a closer contact with the civil society. And in this case, we have more informal instances with group of peoples, not tied to organizations, but we want to listen to them, to listen to their opinions, particularly the groups of youth. of young people. We are designing and planning and financing the future of a country or of a world that young people will see the benefits or the drawbacks of them. So my administration wanted specifically to include the youth at the different stages to get their opinion and that their opinion be reflected or translated into our public policies.
No, yo creo que el involucramiento de la sociedad civil
Engaging the civil society
comienza
starts
por el etiquetado
with
climático y la
the
gestión
climate
de
expend tag and the accountability of national budget. So countries have made different or are at different stages in terms of the progress regarding these two topics. But if we make major steps towards climate expense tax, we will facilitate transparency and accountability, which is the necessary condition so that the civil society can participate. And we can also prioritize climate change and facilitate different treaty adhesion and intergovernmental relationships. So a preliminary step to facilitate the participation of the civil society is to move towards climate expense tagging to help address the topics that I have just mentioned.
Gracias. En eso quisiera mencionar dos cosas y es
just two things. One of the key financing mechanisms for Latin America is the Climate Green Fund, and that promotes the participation, civil society organizations, local communities in the development of projects, but also environmental and social safeguards, which are focused on supporting indigenous communities, local communities that are engaged in governance and in the decision-making of projects. In Colombia, last year, as part of GSF Finding Assess, we had a gender-based policy. So the developers of projects have to include or specify how they include the gender approach and develop tools appropriately if they don't have the necessary tools. And then there is a system in Colombia that we call MDBR, that the purpose is monitoring, reporting, assessing of the resources allocated for climate change and disaster risk management. Our system monitors, classifies all the information related to investment, public, private, national investment that are financed for mitigation, prevention, disaster risk reduction, particularly one of the characteristics of this system is that reports can be used by civil society organizations in the territories that want to develop climate change and risk management projects, because it is a tool that shows the economic instruments that are used in subnational projects, how we can access to those resources, and it's a transparency mechanism and as an access to information. There is a project called Ciudades Como Vamos. So these are the reports that we manage to verify the compliance with the climate targets. So it's also helpful for citizen engagement and compliance with the different climate targets.
We now have an opportunity for our audience to share questions with our panelists, but we'll only be able to take one of these questions. And we move to Carlos from ICAP, who will share with us this question and open up the Slido so that we would be able to receive these questions. Okay, this question is coming quite soon. And I do appreciate the different responses from our panelists previously, because we saw that the responses were quite different in helping civil society to understand the different opportunities for financing for climate change and disaster risk reduction. Guess Carlos is coming soon with the question. Meanwhile, I would just want to highlight a few of the key points that we've had so far from our panelists. This has been quite insightful from the presentation thus far. Is it coming soon? Okay, great. Seeing that we have no questions yet from our audience, we just want to round up and conclude with some of the key points that we've received thus far. From the beginning, we heard of the green taxonomies and the importance of the dialogue between civil society and other groupings. We also understood of the importance of including private sector, ensuring that there's public-private sector partnership, and even looking at financing for disaster risk reduction and climate change. We saw the importance of resilient policies and including this into the budgets of our different ministries. And one of the important points that stood out to me from, I think it was Mexico, was ensuring that the surplus from the different budgets from the ministries are able to go into a sustainable fund that looks at financing resilient activities. I think this could be a best practice that countries in the Latin America and the Caribbean would be able to benefit from. We also looked at measuring the impact. It's always mentioned that if we're unable to measure what we can't measure, we're not able to improve. So if we really want to improve and ensure that we have added resilience, we need to be able to have transparent and accountable measurements for our resilience. We also understood that they're moving targets. Every year there's something new happening, and we see the risks that are increasing around the world. We recently saw with Syria and with Turkey, the major impact that has happened. And in our region, we are prone to disasters. It's been mentioned over the days, and I don't need to repeat that point, but just want to underscore that we have lots of different risks. But it's important that as the risks are increasing, we're able to act fast. And it was mentioned that we should have urgency. And I think that all of us being here, it's an indication that we are committed to resilience. We're committed to disaster risk reduction. So we should act with urgency to put in place measures, whether financing measures and policies to help improve our resilience. We also saw the importance of bridging the gap and having the right interventions. It's not just having interventions for intervention's sake or to ensure that we are having actions, but ensuring that what we implement is impactful. It looks at those who are vulnerable, and it ensures that we bridge the right gap, have the right investments so that we can improve our country's resilience. Follow-up is also important, very important. When we have our different measures, we have financing, it's also important to get the feedback from the stakeholders. We had civil society asking the question. If civil society is unaware that these are available, then we are missing a key stakeholder within our country. So it is really important to follow up and ensure that our different stakeholders within our countries are able to receive the right financing for their resilience. It's always said that if you have a chain and there's a weak link, it's only as strong as its weakest link. So I do encourage our panelists and everyone who's represented here in the different organizations, in the different countries, that we look at the weakest link and see how we could ensure that they too receive the necessary financing so that they could become resilient. I do want to thank all our panelists for your contribution. I want to invite everyone to give our panelists a round of applause for their contribution at today's plenary session. And I do hope that everyone who is sitting here, everyone who has viewed online, would be able to see or to gain some insights into how we can enhance our resilience. Everything would not be a cut and paste for countries or organizations, but at least there's something we could take away, something we could adapt to help improve our resilience. I do also want to thank our organizers, the organizers of this session, for putting together this esteemed panel, for ensuring that we have informative questions or insightful questions that we could gain knowledge from our panelists. And we just want to thank everyone for their investment investment of your time in being here with us today. So once again, thank you all for your contribution to today's session.